I watched as the flames consumed everything my father had built, not knowing it was all part of a cruel man's revenge. My name is Amelia, but everyone calls me A. My father, Oscar, was once a prosperous man, managing a branch under the iron grip of Tomas, a billionaire known for his ruthless nature. My mother, Mariana, had once been with Tomas, but his harsh ways and dark lifestyle drove her away. She chose love over wealth, marrying my father, and together they built a life filled with love, if not luxury. Tomas never forgot Mariana, his pride wounded by her rejection. He watched from afar, his wealth and power growing like a shadow over our lives. My father worked hard, hoping to keep us out of Tomas's reach, but the rich have long arms. Our small town in Colombia was nestled between mountains, where the air was always fresh, but the life was hard. The people here knew each other's stories, and ours was no secret. Tomas, with his vast estate and control over local businesses, was like a king in our midst, and my father was just one of his many subjects. Life was good until one fateful night when the branch my father managed went up in flames. I remember the smoke, thick and black, blotting out the stars, the heat so intense it felt like the sun had fallen to earth. My father tried to save what he could, but it was too late. The fire, we thought, was just an unfortunate accident, but we were wrong. That night changed everything. We didn't know then that Tomas had planted a thief in the branch, setting the stage for the fire. His plan was simple and cruel: to break my father, to make him lose everything, hoping my mother would return to him. But my parents' love was stronger than Tomas's schemes. They stood by each other, even as the ashes of their dreams turned cold. The morning after the fire was silent, a stark contrast to the crackling chaos of the previous night. The villagers gathered, murmuring about the disaster, some offering help, others whispering about curses or bad luck. My father stood there, his face smudged with soot, his eyes reflecting the loss of his life's work. We went home, the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes, the future uncertain. My mother, ever the pillar of strength, made coffee, her hands steady while her heart must have been racing. She looked at my father, her eyes asking if he was okay, but knowing he wasn't. In the days that followed, my father tried to piece together what went wrong. He talked to the local police, who were either too afraid or too bought to look into it properly. No one dared to point fingers at Tomas, whose influence was as vast as the sky above our village. The business agreement between my father and Tomas had a clause neither of us knew about until it was too late. Any damage or loss at the branch was on my father, a debt he could never repay. Tomas, with a smirk hidden behind a facade of sympathy, offered help, but it was help that would chain my father to him forever. Tomas came to our house, dressed in fine clothes that mocked our simple living. He sat at our table, his presence filling the room with dread. He spoke of debts and obligations, his voice smooth but his eyes cold. My father, desperate and seeing no other way, listened as Tomas laid out his plan. The weight of the debt was not just financial. It was a burden on our spirits. My mother, who had once known Tomas's affection, now saw only his malice. She held my father's hand under the table, a silent promise that no matter what, they were together. The village began to see us differently. No longer were we the family with a bright future. We were now the cautionary tale of what happens when you cross the billionaire. Yet in our small home, love was our sanctuary. My parents taught me about resilience, about fighting against the odds, even when the enemy was not just a man but a system designed to keep us down. As I grew up, I learned to read the signs of trouble, to see the shadows cast by Tomas's machinations. I watched my parents struggle, their love tested by fires both literal and metaphorical. But the true test was yet to come, one that would involve me in ways I could never have imagined. The village was still whispering about the fire when the truth of our situation began to dawn on us. My father, Oscar, was now shouldering the blame for the branch's destruction, a blame that was not his to bear, but was forced upon him by the terms of his contract with Tomas. We didn't know the full extent of Tomas's cruelty until the debts started piling up. Every day, it seemed, there was a new bill, a new reminder of our loss, and a new slice of our dignity taken away. My father sold what little he had left, but the debt was like a bottomless pit, and Tomas was always there, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction at every payment my father made. Our home, once filled with laughter, was now silent, save for the quiet discussions about how to survive another day. My mother, Mariana, took on extra work, her hands, once soft, now calloused from the labor of others. We ate less, laughed less, but somehow our bond grew stronger, forged in the fires of adversity. I was too young to fully grasp the magnitude of our situation, but I felt the change. My toys, once many, dwindled, and my clothes were mended more often than replaced. The village children, once my playmates, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. One evening, as we sat around the dim light of our single lamp, Tomas visited again. His presence was like a storm cloud over our home. He spoke in measured tones, offering help that was really another chain. He proposed that my father could work off the debt by taking on more tasks under his control, making Oscar nothing more than a slave to Tomas's whims. My father, with no options left, agreed. But the work was backbreaking, and the pay was just enough to keep us from starvation, never enough to chip away at the debt. Tomas had us exactly where he wanted us, dependent, broken, but not yet destroyed. Rumors started to circulate about how the fire might not have been an accident. Some whispered about Tomas's involvement, but these were hushed quickly, drowned in fear or bought silence. My father refused to believe these rumors at first. He couldn't fathom the depth of Tomas's malice. But as we fell further into poverty, the truth became undeniable. My father's colleagues at Tomas's other businesses would occasionally slip, mentioning how Tomas had boasted about teaching someone a lesson, about how one must pay for their choices. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. The village, which once respected my father for his hard work and integrity, now saw him as a man whose luck had run out. But I saw him as a hero, fighting against a giant with nothing but love and determination. We lived in a constant state of alertness, waiting for the next blow from Tomas. My mother would often cry at night, believing I was asleep, her tears a quiet lament for the life we had lost. My father would comfort her, his voice a soothing balm, promising that we would rise again, somehow, someway. As the years went by, the fire became a distant memory, but its scars remained. We learned to live with less, to find joy in each other's company, and to hold on tight when the world seemed to want to pull us apart. Yet the shadow of Tomas loomed large, his revenge not complete. He had taken our wealth, our pride, but he wanted more. He wanted to see us utterly broken. And for me, the worst was yet to come. As time passed, the debt to Tomas seemed to grow rather than diminish. My father, Oscar, worked tirelessly, but no matter how much he paid or how much he toiled, the shadow of Tomas's control over us only darkened. The villagers could see our decline. Once we had been among the wealthier families, but now we lived in the shadow of what we once were. My mother, Mariana, turned our small garden into a place where we could grow our own food, a necessity rather than a luxury. I learned to appreciate the simple joy of picking vegetables, knowing it meant another meal on our table. Our home, which had once been filled with the chatter of visitors and the laughter of friends, now echoed with the silence of isolation. We couldn't afford social engagements, and our friends, fearing Tomas's influence, distanced themselves. But in this solitude, we found strength in each other. One day my father came home, his face pale, his spirit broken. He had learned of a clause in the contract that made him personally liable for any loss at the branch. This meant that not only was he responsible for the fire's damage, but also for the ongoing losses that the business incurred due to the disruption. The debt was now not just money, but his entire life savings, and it wasn't enough. Tomas had designed it this way, ensuring that my father would be tied to him indefinitely. With every payment, my father was signing away years of his life, his freedom, and our future. Tomas's visits became less about offering help and more about asserting his dominance, his control. I remember one particular evening when Tomas came. his voice smooth as silk, but his words like chains. He suggested that perhaps, in time, the debt could be forgiven if my father complied with certain conditions. My mother's eyes narrowed, sensing the trap, but my father, desperate and cornered, was open to anything that might ease our burden. We didn't know then that Tomas had another plan, one that involved me, his final play in this cruel game of power and revenge. But for now, we were just trying to survive the day-to-day, to keep our heads above water in a sea of financial ruin. My parents decided to keep the extent of our situation from me, but children often understand more than adults give them credit for. I saw the worry lines deepen on my father's face, the way my mother's smiles were forced, and I felt the weight of a debt that was not ours to bear. Our meals became simpler, our clothes more patched, our celebrations quieter. But amidst this hardship, I was born, a light in their darkness. My parents named me Amelia, hoping I would bring back some of the joy they had lost. Despite everything, they showered me with love, teaching me resilience and showing me that even in poverty, there could be dignity. The village started to see me not as the daughter of a once prosperous man, but as a symbol of hope amid despair. I played with the children whose parents whispered about us, but I made friends, finding laughter in the simple games of childhood. But the debt was always there, like a dark cloud that refused to pass. Tomas's power over us was absolute, and even in our happiest moments, there was the understanding that we were not free. My father's once proud spirit was subdued, his eyes often lost in thought about how to escape this endless cycle of payment without end. As I grew, I learned about the world's cruelty through the eyes of my parents' struggle. But I also learned about love, resilience, and the quiet strength of two people who refused to be completely crushed by a man's malice. Little did I know, I was to become the next piece in Tomas's game, a pawn in his quest for ultimate control over my family. Years went by, and I grew from a child into a young woman, unaware of the dark promise that had been made over my head. My 16th birthday was approaching, and while my family celebrated this milestone with what little we had, an undercurrent of tension ran through our home. My parents, Oscar and Mariana, tried to keep the joy alive, but I could see the worry in their eyes, especially in my father's. There were whispered conversations late at night, my mother's voice rising in concern, my father's in defeat. I knew something was wrong, but the full truth was kept from me like a dark secret. On the day of my birthday, Tomas came to our home. His presence was like a cold wind, chilling the warm air of celebration. He brought no gift, only the weight of his gaze upon me, appraising, calculating. He spoke in riddles, talking about debts and obligations, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin crawl. After he left, my parents sat me down. My father's face was a mask of sorrow, his voice trembling as he told me of the promise he had made. In a moment of desperation years ago, when the debt seemed insurmountable, Tomas had offered to clear it if I were given to him when I turned 16. I remember the shock, the betrayal I felt. How could my father agree to such a thing? But my mother was quick to explain the depths of our desperation, the sleepless nights, the hunger, the fear of losing everything. My father had agreed, believing he would find another way, that it would never come to pass. But here we were, with Tomas holding us to our word. The village started to murmur about my fate, about how the daughter of Oscar would be used to settle a debt. Some pitied me. Others warned my parents of the folly of dealing with Tomas. But no one dared to interfere openly. His power was too great. My parents, in their love for me, had kept this secret hoping to protect me. But now it was out, and the reality of what my life might become set in. My mother cried, holding me close, promising that they would find a way out of this. My father, his eyes haunted, spoke of fighting back, of legal avenues, but we all knew Tomas's influence stretched far beyond our small village. I was caught between anger at my father for making such a promise and fear for what my future held. I began to see Tomas differently, not just as the cruel billionaire, but as a personal threat, a shadow over my life. With each passing day, the dread grew. Would Tomas come to claim me? Would my life be one of servitude to him, or worse. My parents watched me with eyes full of guilt and love, trying to make my remaining days of freedom as joyful as possible. We walked through the village, through the fields, and sat by the river, soaking in moments that felt like the last of peace. I started to learn more about Tomas, about his past with my mother, about his ruthless business dealings. I read books, listened to the elders, pieced together the story of a man who used his power to bend lives to his will. My 16th birthday came and went, but the promise hung over us like a sword of Damocles. By some miracle, or perhaps Tomas's own twisted game, he did not immediately claim what he believed was his due. But we lived knowing that any day could be the one when he decided to enforce his claim. As I turned 17, the tension did not ease. The promise was still there, a silent threat. My parents had tried everything from legal battles to begging for mercy, but Tomas was not a man to be swayed by anything but his own desires. The village saw me differently now, not just as the hopeful young girl, but as a pawn in a billionaire's game, a reminder of how far one man's cruelty could reach. My 17th birthday came and went with little fanfare. The joy of celebration had been replaced by a looming dread. The village knew the promise, and whispers followed me like shadows. My parents, Oscar and Mariana, had aged years in a matter of months, the weight of their choice burdening them with every passing day. Tomas, ever the puppeteer, had bided his time, letting the tension grow like a vine around our lives. But as the new year dawned, he made his move. He came to our home, not with the pomp of a billionaire, but with the quiet assurance of a man who knew he held all the cards. He sat at our table, his presence filling the small room with an air of finality. "The time has come," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your debt, Oscar, can no longer be ignored. Your daughter, Amelia, is to pay it off." My father protested, his voice breaking. My mother held my hand, her grip tight with fear. I felt like a deer in headlights, my heart racing as I tried to comprehend my fate. But Tomas was not here for negotiation. He was here to claim what he believed was his. However, there was a twist. Tomas revealed that he wouldn't claim me for himself, but for his son, Santiago. This was news to us all. Santiago had been brought back to the village after years away with his drug-addicted mother. He was a stranger to me, a figure of rumors and cautionary tales. Tomas explained that Santiago needed a wife to stabilize his life, to ensure he could take over the family business. "He is my legacy," Tomas said, "and you, Amelia, will be part of that legacy." My parents were horrified, my mother especially, knowing the kind of man Tomas was, fearing what his son might be like. I was to be married off to a man I didn't know, a man raised in a world of excess and neglect, to settle a debt that was never mine. The village was abuzz with the news. Some saw it as a twisted fairy tale, others as a tragedy. My friends whispered condolences, their eyes filled with pity. I walked through the village, feeling like a ghost, disconnected from my own life. Santiago was introduced to me in a formal meeting, his eyes cold, his demeanor distant. He didn't seem to want this any more than I did. He was tall, with an air of someone who had seen too much too young, his life marked by his mother's addiction and his father's abandonment. My father, desperate, tried one last time to negotiate, to find another way, but Tomas was immovable. This was the agreement. He reminded us his words like steel. "Or you'll remain in debt forever." I had no choice, my parents had no choice. We were cornered by the terms of a contract made in desperation. The wedding was planned swiftly, with none of the joy or preparation that should accompany such an event. It was more like a funeral for my freedom. I spent my nights crying, my days in a haze, trying to prepare for a life I never wanted. My mother taught me what she could about being a wife, her lessons laced with sorrow. My father, defeated, sought solace in silence, his eyes avoiding mine as if he couldn't bear the weight of his decision. The village prepared for the wedding, but it felt like an execution rather than a celebration. I saw Santiago a few more times, each encounter more awkward than the last. He was as much a victim of his father's schemes as I was, but his resentment was palpable, directed at his father and, by extension, at me. As the day approached, I felt the walls closing in. My life, my dreams, everything was being handed over to settle a debt. I was to marry a man who didn't love me, who might not even know how to, all because of a promise made when I was too young to have a say. And so, with a heavy heart, I prepared to enter a marriage that was more about settling accounts than about love. The promise my father had made was now my reality, and the only thing left was to see how I would survive in the shadow of Tomas's legacy. The day of my wedding felt like the end of the world. The village was decked out in celebration, but the colors seemed dull, the music hollow. I wore a dress that was supposed to be beautiful, but it felt like a shroud. My parents, their faces masks of forced smiles, stood by me, their hearts breaking behind their eyes. Santiago stood at the altar, his face an unreadable mask. His demeanor was one of resignation rather than joy. He had been forced into this as much as I, yet there was an anger in him, a silent fury aimed at his father, Tomas, who watched the proceedings with a smug satisfaction. The ceremony was quick, a transaction rather than a union. Amelia, said I do with a voice that didn't sound like my own, echoing through the church like a distant, sad note. Santiago's response was barely audible, his eyes never meeting mine. We were married, but we were strangers bound by debt and power. After the wedding, the reception was a blur. I smiled when expected, danced when prompted, but inside, I was numb. Santiago drank, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. We were both prisoners in this new life, but I was the one who bore the weight of the debt. That night, as we entered what was now our home, the reality of our situation crashed down. Santiago didn't look at me with love or even kindness. There was a hardness, a coldness. He saw me not as a wife, but as part of his father's manipulation. The first night was terrifying. Santiago's anger, fueled by years of resentment towards his father, was unleashed on me. He was rough, uncaring, forcing himself upon me, taking what he believed was his right as my husband. I lay there, tears streaming, feeling my soul fracturing under the weight of my new reality. This pattern continued, Santiago taking out his frustration on me, his cruel hands and harsh words becoming my nightly reality. He didn't know how to love, how to care, having been raised in a world of neglect and vice. I became the target of his rage, his disdain for his father manifested in the way he treated me. The days were no better. He was often absent, spending his time with other women, flaunting his freedom while I was trapped in the role of the dutiful wife. The village talked, some in sympathy, others in scandal, but no one dared to intervene. Tomas's shadow was long, and his son was his extension. My nights were spent crying, the pillows soaked with my tears. I thought of escape, of ending it all, but the love for my parents, their sacrifice for me, kept me tethered to life. I was their daughter, their hope, and I couldn't let them down by giving up. One night, Santiago's anger led to violence beyond the usual. A beating so severe that it resulted in a miscarriage I hadn't even known I was carrying. I lay in pain, my body and heart broken, thinking this might be the end. But I survived, if only barely. In the hospital, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptics, I made a vow to myself. I would not return to that house of pain, even if it meant my death. The doctors, nurses, even some villagers who visited, all saw the truth in my bruises, the silent testament to my suffering. My parents, Oscar and Mariana, came to see me, their faces etched with guilt and sorrow. They apologized, my father's voice breaking as he promised to find a way to free me. But I knew there was no escape from Tomas's grasp without a fight, without a change. As I lay there, healing physically but not emotionally, I realized that my life had become a battleground. I had to find a way to reclaim myself, to turn this forced union into something I could at least survive. But how does one fight when the chains are made of debt and decrees? Santiago didn't visit me in the hospital. He was too busy living his life, perhaps hoping I would just disappear from his. But I was still his wife, bound by law and by a debt that seemed to grow with each passing day. This was my life now, a life of endurance, of waiting for a moment to breathe, to find some semblance of peace or at least justice. But for now, all I could do was heal, plan, and hope that one day the nightmare would end. While I was in the hospital, word of my condition spread through the village like wildfire. The villagers, who had once whispered about my fate, now spoke openly of Tomas's cruelty and Santiago's neglect. But even this public disdain couldn't touch Tomas, who lay sick in his opulent home, his power waning with his health. Tomas, now bedridden, was a shadow of the man who had once seemed invincible. His illness had stripped him of his control, leaving him with nothing but the reflection of his life's deeds. He realized, perhaps too late, that he had lived a life without love, without true loyalty, surrounded by people who feared rather than loved him. Meanwhile, Santiago had inherited his father's fortune, but not the wisdom to manage it. He sought comfort in his mother, only to find that she had not changed despite the years apart. She scammed him, taking all his money and fleeing with Santiago's friend, leaving him even more alone than before. Santiago's life spiraled. Without his father's guidance or his mother's presence, he was lost, his anger turning inward, leading to a severe depression. One night, while driving recklessly, overthinking his life and losses, he crashed his car, landing himself in the hospital, just floors below where I was recovering. I heard of his accident, not from him, but from the village gossip that reached even the sterile confines of the hospital. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction. The other part, the part that had once hoped for some semblance of peace, felt sorrow for the man who had once been my husband. I decided to visit him, not out of love or forgiveness, but out of a sense of duty, of humanity. I brought him food, supplies, showing him a kindness he had never shown me. But I kept my distance, my heart guarded, my visits brief. I wouldn't let him see me, not fully, not yet. Santiago's recovery was slow, his body healing faster than his spirit. He was forced to face the consequences of his actions, the emptiness of his life, and the realization that I might have been the closest thing he had to love, however twisted that love had been. As the months passed, I grew stronger both in body and resolve. I returned to my parents' home, refusing to go back to the house I shared with Santiago. My parents, Oscar and Mariana, supported me, their love a balm to my wounds. The village began to see me not just as a victim, but as a survivor, someone who had faced the worst and was still standing. Santiago, on the other hand, had to rebuild his life from scratch. With his father's health failing, his mother gone, and his inheritance squandered, he was forced to work, to learn what it meant to earn respect rather than demand it. He started small businesses, learned to manage what little he had left, and slowly he began to change. But my life was no longer about him. I focused on healing, on finding joy in the small things, on reconnecting with the community. I volunteered, taught the village children, and helped my parents in their daily struggles. Life was hard, but it was mine again. Tomas, in his final days, called for Santiago, his last act one of confession rather than command. He handed over documents, not just of his businesses, but of his sins. He admitted to orchestrating the fire, to manipulating lives, including mine and my family's, for his own satisfaction. Santiago, reading the confessions, was struck by the magnitude of his father's cruelty and the depth of his own complicity. He cried, not just for his father's impending death, but for the life he had led, for the pain he had caused me. He decided to seek forgiveness, not just from me, but from my family, knowing he could never undo the past, but hoping to make amends for the future. He came to our home, his pride swallowed by regret, his eyes those of a man who had seen the error of his ways. I listened to his apologies, my heart heavy with memories, but also with the possibility of peace. My father, Oscar, forgave him, understanding the cycle of hurt that had been passed down. My mother, Mariana, saw the change in him, the sincerity in his remorse. But for me, forgiveness was not so simple. I told Santiago that while I could forgive, I could not return to being his wife. I needed to heal, to live a life free from the shadow of Tomas's legacy and Santiago's past actions. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Santiago would have to prove his change, where I would have to learn to trust again, and where we would all have to find a way to live with the scars of our past. Months passed since Santiago's heartfelt apology, and life in the village began to settle into a new normal. Santiago worked tirelessly, his once proud demeanor replaced by humility. He started small businesses with the integrity he had never shown before, earning back the respect he had lost in the eyes of the community. I, Amelia, watched from afar, my heart a mix of caution and curiosity. I had seen his change, his struggle, but the wounds of our past were not easily healed. My days were filled with teaching the village children, helping my parents, and finding joy in my newfound freedom. Santiago sought me out, not with demands or expectations, but with genuine efforts to make amends. He volunteered alongside me, helped the village without seeking recognition, and most importantly, he listened when I spoke of my pain, of the life he had forced upon me. Our friendship grew from these shared moments, from shared work, from the shared understanding that we had both been pawns in Tomas's game. Santiago's presence was no longer a threat, but a reminder of how far we had come, how much we had changed. Santiago spoke of his regrets, of how he wished he could erase the past, but knew he could only build a better future. He asked for another chance, not as a husband at first, but as someone who wanted to earn my trust, my respect. I thought long and hard, consulting with my parents, with the village elders, with my own heart. The decision was not made lightly, but seeing the sincerity in Santiago's actions, I agreed to give him a chance, not to reclaim our marriage, but to start anew, as friends. This friendship blossomed over time. Santiago became a part of our family gatherings, working alongside my father, laughing with my mother, playing with the village children. He was no longer the son of Tomas, but a man making his own path. Then one day, Santiago proposed again, but this time it was different. His eyes held love, not obligation. He spoke of a future where we could choose each other, not be forced by debts or decrees. It was a proposal of equals, of hearts that had healed and chosen to mend together. I accepted, and our second wedding was nothing like the first. It was filled with genuine laughter, with music that resonated with joy, not duty. We were surrounded by friends, by a community that had seen our journey from despair to hope. We built a new life together, one where Santiago treated me as his equal, where love was not a burden but a choice. A year after our remarriage, I gave birth to a son, a symbol of our new beginning, our love, and our commitment to a life of mutual respect and understanding. Tomas's legacy was no longer one of fear, but a lesson learned, a story told to remind us of the dangers of power without compassion. Santiago, who once took without giving, now gave back to the community, ensuring his son would grow up knowing the value of kindness over cruelty. We lived happily, not because every day was perfect, but because we faced life's challenges together, with love, with forgiveness, and with the understanding that even the darkest paths can lead to light if you walk them with the right person by your side. And so, our story became one of redemption, of second chances, and of the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest of wounds. Thanks for watching. Please kindly like, share, subscribe, and turn on notification for more interesting tales. Thank you.